Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is the new YouTube series on helping you improve your chess. And this is the fourth video in the series. And I thought in this video we would talk about a strategy called break moves. Another name for break moves is called a pawn break. And if that's a hint, it should be, because a break move is a pawn move, and it's a pawn move against a fixed pawn of the opponent. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at an example. Okay, example would be, let's say white opens up d4 and black plays d5. This black pawn on d5 is fixed, meaning it can't move. It's up against another pawn. So in this case, white can attack that pawn with a pawn, and that would be a break move. In this position, white has two break moves, c4 and e4, and these are both major openings. If white plays the gambit move e4, this is called the black-mar-d-mar gambit. And black could here transpose into a French. Black could play a caro-can. But the main line is to accept the gambit and play d takes e4. So that's white's break move e4. The more common break move, of course, is to play c4. And this is the very, very famous position in chess called the Queen's Gambit. And the Queen's Gambit is one of the best examples of a break move. White plays c4. What does a break move do? Well, it breaks up the opponent's pawn structure. For instance, if black tries to keep his pawns intact with e6, which is the Queen's Gambit declined, if white wanted to, at some point, white could take on d5 and trade off his side c pawn for, basically he's trading it for the black center e pawn. They both still have d pawns. All right, so what does that do? Well, in this case, it opens up a semi-open file for white on the C file and gives black a semi-open file on the E file. Opening up files like that helps your queens and your rooks, but also opening up lines and trading off pawns may help all your pieces. They could certainly help bishops, and they may even, in some rare cases, help knights as well. So this gives you the opportunity to trade where your opponent can't stop you. Now, what's an example of a pawn attack against a pawn that's not a break move? By the way, a pawn attack against a pawn, the name given to that by Hans Kmock in his book Pawn Power in Chess, which I find a really, really good book. I learned a lot from it. A lot of people don't like it because it has strange nomenclature, but I didn't pay any attention to the nomenclature. I simply read the concepts of the book. And if you ask me what a Milano-Pena problem is versus leukopenia problem, I could guess, but I don't really care. All I know is what is it that I recognize weak white squares or weak dark squares, and how do I take advantage of that? I really don't care what Hans Kmock called it. I read the book. It was funny. I read the book. I thought it was fantastic. And, 30 years later, I recommended it to someone, and they said, oh, I can't read this book. It's got all those crazy nomenclature in it. And I'm like, oh, really? Who cares? Anyway, back to break moves. Let's look at a break move that a move that attacks a pawn that's not a break move. So here, suppose black plays a Benoni with c5. This is not a break move because the main line for white is to go past the pawn. So when black plays that move c5, he's not assuring that he's going to open up some lines. So actually he's allowing white to go past him and close up the position somewhat. So this would not qualify as a break move. Now, when you play a break move, is it always because the opponent can't go past? And the answer is, well, can't as opposed to not legally go past. Let's look at the major lines of the Sicilian called the open Sicilian. White plays e4, black plays c5, white plays knight f3, and here black has a variety of moves, but let's say he plays d6. And now white plays d4, and the question is that a break move? Well, you might say, no, it's not, because black has the option of going past. The problem is that black can't play c4 without just losing a pawn to bishop takes c4. So the move of d4, even though black can go legally past, has the same effect as a break move. And basically here black wants to trade his side pawn for a center pawn. C takes d, knight takes d4. Now that we've described what a break move is, let's talk a little bit about the strategy of break moves. The strategy of break moves is probably the only what I would consider intermediate strategy that I need to teach to people that are below intermediate level. Break moves are so important, they're so uh, ubiquitous to the game of chess, and they occur so much that it's very, very difficult to play a chess game without a break move. And when I get new students that are, fairly weak and they don't know about break moves and they don't play break moves, they always complain to me, man, I play chess, but a lot of times I get a cramped game, because they don't understand that the break move is what they're trying to play to break open the position and stop their opponent's pawns from cramping them. And when they don't understand that concept, it makes the whole rest of the game go downhill. So when I wrote like a novice nook called, Everything You Need to Know About Strategy Till You Get to 1700, when I wrote that kind of article, I basically said, well, you need to know things like use all your pieces all the time and try to control the center, and in using all the pieces all the time, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic, all these kind of strategical things. And then I said there's one more advanced concept, more advanced than what I've been teaching, that you really do need to know before you get to 1700. In fact, even before you get to 13 or 1400, and that's break moves. So break moves aren't a terribly difficult concept, but they are a little bit advanced. Not very advanced, but a little bit advanced. But they're absolutely essential. You need to understand when you need to break and how to break. Well, when are break moves helpful? Well, we just saw some examples where break moves are helpful in the opening, and I'm going to show some more because it's easy to show opening examples. But actually, break moves are important in middle games. They're important in end games. I mean, let's set up a crazy end game position. Let's say, let's put a whole bunch of pawns on the board, and we'll lock up the board like this. And we're just going to lock up the board with pawns. Okay. So suppose the position has something like this, where nobody has any break moves and nobody can break through. Well, here, white is up a rook, but because he doesn't have any open lines, he can't get in, and he went past instead of breaking open the position, and the game is a draw. But let's change the white pawn on h5 and put him on h3. Now it's quite easy for white to win. White will simply play the break move, h4. Notice black can't go past. Black will sit there and, wait. Let's say he goes up here. And white will take. He wants to open up lines for his rook. Takes back, and now he'll bring the rook to the 8th rank and get behind. Even if black's king were on a different square, let's start with black's king on g8 instead of g7. And white plays h4 and black plays king g7, and then pawn takes, pawn takes. White will simply win by playing rook h5, attacking this pawn, and when black guards it, he'll go behind the rook, behind the king, and get in like that. So this is an example where a very trivial break move in the endgame will break open the h-file and white will win. So if you play over Grandmaster games, I can almost assure you there's going to be a break move for both sides in almost every single game. It's pretty much impossible to play chess with without some break moves. It is possible that you could bring out some pawns they could capture with pieces and they don't need break moves. So yes, it is possible. It's not impossible, but most games are played with break moves for both sides, and they play them in the opening, they play them in the middle game, and they play them in the end game. What could be more important than that, than a concept like this that occurs in the opening, the middle game, and the end game? All right, let's take a look at some more break moves in the opening. Let's reset the board. And let's look at two of the most famous break moves. And two of the most famous break moves are break moves when the center is completely fixed or locked with pawns together. And we have a name for this kind of pattern and what you should do. And let's set it up. Let's say someone plays a French. e4, e6, d4, d5. And now white plays the advanced variation, which a lot of beginners like. They think that's the natural move. And it is fairly natural, but it isn't the number one move. The number one move is to play knight to c3. And I've always played Tarish knight d2. But let's say they play the advanced e5. Okay. When all four center pawns are locked together and can't move because they're up against each other, the E and D files completely have no pawn moves possible. then we have what's called the pointing rule. And I've seen this misapplied so many times, I can't tell you, of people misunderstanding this rule and applying it wrong. And then they wonder what happened. But this is the pure example here. The center is completely locked. The E and D pawns can't move. And now if you put your hand across your center pawns, it'll point to the side that you want to attack on and the side you want to break on. So if white puts his hand across his D and E pawns, it'll look like that arrow. And white should attack on the king side, and his break move is going to be F5 to break open in the king side. Black, on the other hand, will put his hand, let's take the arrows off the board for a second, he'll put his hand across his E and D pawns, and it'll point to the queen side. Notice, if you're applying the pointing rule correctly, both sides should point to the opposite side. If you're using the pointing rule and somehow you're misapplying it and they're both pointing to the same side, that doesn't make any sense, because here the pawn structure is telling white, you have more space toward the king side, your pieces are behind the wall to the king side, you should attack on the king side. Black's pieces should therefore tell him that his advantage is toward the queen side. If black also points to the king side, which should be impossible under the definition I gave, then the game would be saying to both players, you have the advantage on the same side as the board. Well, that's not possible. White can't be better than black on the king side and black be better than white on the king side. Those two things are not possible. Just like A can't be bigger than B and B bigger than A. That's just not possible. So in this position, where's black's famous break move? It's to play C5. And this is the main line. If you look this up in an opening book or a database, this move is played the overwhelming majority of the times, the famous break move C5, and then white plays C3 to keep his pawn structure. And maybe later, when he's ready, black will play his other break move, F6, but then he's attacking on the side of the board where white wants to be, so that's not as effective. And also, when you chop down a pawn structure like this, it's like chopping down a tree. If you weaken the base of the pawn structure, the front of the base gets weaker also. So that the pawns get weaker when you chop down the pawns at the back of the base. And when you chop down the pawns at the front of the base, the rest of the tree is not weakened. So that's why they always say attack at the base of the pawn chain first. It's not that you should never attack at the top. Attacking at the top in the French is quite common. But you attack at the base primarily and usually first. So that's the break move. How could we misapply the pointing rule? Well, here's some of the ways I've seen it misapplied. I've seen people apply the pointing rule like this: D4, D5, E3, E6. And they say, I can't play E4 because he could take me. He can't play E5. So therefore, the center pawns are kind of fixed. White's pawns are pointing to the queen side. I guess I should break over there. And black's pawns are pointing to the queen side. I guess he should break over there. Well, it's true that C4 and C5 are probably good break moves here. But this is misapplying the pointing rule, because the E and the D pawns are not all completely locked together. Even though the E pawn can't move without being taken for either side, it still can move. So the center pawns are not locked together, and the two sides are pointing to the same side. So you should not apply the pointing rule here. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't play C4 or C5. It just means the pointing rule really doesn't apply to this kind of position. Similarly, the pointing rule would not make much sense if you applied it to pawns that were not the center pawns. Let's try to apply it to the A and B pawns. So we'll play like B4, C5, B5, knight F6, A4, knight G8. I'm just trying to lock these pawns over here. A5, knight F6, A6, B6. So here we have these four pawns locked together. I've had people use the pointing rule for this too. And they say, all right, white pawns are pointing to the left, so I should attack queen side. Black pawns are pointing to toward the right side. He should attack king side. This doesn't make any sense. If white's going to attack to the left of his pawn chain, he'd be attacking to the left of the A file, which there is no files left of the A file. So applying the pointing rule here doesn't make any sense at all. So if you apply it when all four center pawns are locked together and absolutely can't move because they're up against each other, That's when the pointing rule makes sense. The more they're not the center pawns, the more it would make no sense. And when they get toward the side, it makes absolutely no sense. So I tell people, unless you've got the 4 center pawns locked together, not just can't move because they would be lost, but literally have no moves. In this case, here they are. Unless it's like this, you're probably going to have some problems applying this pointing rule. Okay, when else could you apply the pointing rule? Well, the other major opening where you do it is called the King's Indian. So let's look at the King's Indian and some break moves there. D4, Knight F6, C4, G6, Knight C3, Bishop G7, E4, D6, Bishop E2, main line, castle, Knight F3, E5, main line. It looks like white can win that pawn, but black will get a discovered attack getting his pawn back. So white's main move here is to castle, and black's main move is to play knight to C6. And now white needs to do something about the pressure on D4, so he plays D5, and black plays knight E7. And now we sort of have the mirror image of the French defense. Instead of the white pawn on E5 and the black pawn on E6, we've got the white pawn on D5 and the black pawn on D6, and the white pawn on E4 and the black pawn on E5. So here we are. There's the 4 center pawns all locked together. So yes, now the pointing rule applies. Let's do it for white. White's pawns are pointing to the queen side. His pawn break's going to be on the queen side, and therefore the pawn break that he's going to shoot for is going to be C5. Let's take the arrows off of there. Black's pawns, his 2 center pawns, are pointing toward the king side. Notice if you were sitting in the black side of the table, let's flip the board, game flip, and you're sitting on that side of the board and you put your hand across these 2 pawns, it's going to be pointing up toward the queen side, toward the king side, up this way. That means black's famous break move in the King's Indian is F5. I'll tell you a funny story. A few years ago, I went to Manhattan and I watched Kasparov play a game against, I think it was Deep Fritz. And Deep Fritz played an opening where he needed to play the break move F5. And Kasparov had the move C5 to break. And Kasparov, of course, learned this when he was a little kid. And he went for his break, and for some reason the computer either wasn't good enough positionally or didn't have enough book or whatever it took. It didn't understand that it needed to play the break move. So everybody in the audience is watching the game, and Kasparov is playing his break move and getting all his space and attacking on one side of the board, and the computer doesn't know what to do. It's not playing its break move on the other side. And of course everybody in the audience is like, he's got to play F5 or he just loses. And the computer never did, and Kasparov just rolled over the computer, and everybody kind of looked around like, well, that wasn't a very fun game. Kasparov got into a position where he needed to break on the queen side, and he did, and the computer got into a game where he needed to break on the king side, and it never did, and it just lost. So, not understanding what you have to do in these kind of positions can be very dangerous. Also, let me take the lines off the board again. I once had a student who was playing a position like this in the World Open. Now, there are lots of lines in the King's Indian where you also play your secondary break move C6. In fact, sometimes you even play it first in some lines of the King's Indian, but not here. And he was playing a position, and my student was rated maybe, 15, 1600. And he was playing a position somewhat like this. And he decided he would break on the queen. He was black, and instead of playing the F5 break, he decided to play the C6 break and then attack on the queen side. Well, if you notice right now, white has more space on the queen side. White has more pieces that can easily get to the queen side, and black's pieces are pretty much behind this wall of pawns here. Well, that means black is attacking on the side where he's weaker, and that goes against one of Steinitz's principles. Steinitz's principle says, attack where you're strong, don't attack where you're weak. Well, he was attacking where he was weak, and of course he got killed. So we were going over the game afterwards, and I said to my student, why did you break on the wrong side of the board? You remember the pointing rule? And he said, yeah. And I said, you play the King's Indian? And he said, yeah. And I said, why didn't you play for F5? And he said, well, I wanted to experiment and see what would happen if I played c6 instead? You know what I told him? I said, you paid $300 and some to enter the World Open and you're going to experiment doing things that you know are not the right idea? I said, I'll give you a much better place to experiment. Try experimenting when you're playing a speed game. You can break with c6 here all you want in speed games. Don't do it at the World Open. At the World Open, do the stuff that you know that you're supposed to do and leave the experimenting for games that don't mean very much. All right, so what's one of the modern lines here to show these breaks? Well, a very popular move these days is knight to e1. Why knight to e1? Well, white wants to do two things. He wants to bring the knight to d3 where he can support the break move, and also when black plays the break move, he wants to be able to just play f3 and maintain the center. So the main move against knight e1 is knight d7, and now the move order they've been playing a lot is bishop to e3, again to support white's break move on c5. And after black plays f5 to play his break move, notice that black has moved the knight off of here, violating the principle move every piece once before you move any piece twice, because if he doesn't get this break move in really soon, his pieces will be super cramped and he'll have nowhere to go. So he's got to get his break move in fast, and there's nowhere for his rooks and his queens to go anyway in the position. If he would move them all once before he moved them all twice without making this break move, they would have no place to go. So he has to move the knight twice to do the break move. By the way, the principle is the more closed and locked the position is, the more you can afford to maneuver around, because the armies aren't in conflict with each other yet, and using time to move a piece twice like that is not as dangerous when the position is not open. But of course, I tell my students, learn to walk before you can run. Try to move all your pieces once before you move a piece twice. But if you're playing this line in the King's Indian, it's going to be really tough if you try to do that. So bishop to e3, f5, and white plays f3. And now black has the choice of opening up this line. But if black takes here, white could take with the knight. And now there's no pawns to drive away that nice knight in the center. So the main line here is for black to play f4 and bishop f2 and then go for his next break move on g4. The problem is white can immediately play for this break with c5 very quickly with a move like knight to d3, and if necessary rook c1, and black really can't take time to stop the break move with moves like b6 because white can always reinforce it with b4. Black needs to open up the king side as fast as possible, but the computers have said that white's position is better here. So the grandmasters, ever since the computers got really good, have not been playing this line as much anymore, because the kind of point is that white gets in his break move first, and it's a little bit hard to play the black position. It used to be fun before the computers were helping, and black would get these monster kingside attacks where he would sacrifice pieces and checkmate white. But as the computers became better and better at helping white figure out how to put his pieces in the opening, the popularity of this line has waned, so that Bobby Fischer used to play this all the time, and Viktor Korchnoi, and the young Garry Kasparov. But then the older Garry Kasparov kind of got a little discouraged, and against Kramnik, Kramnik was playing the b4 lines, and he gave up the King's Indian. All right, so break moves, very, very important. Let's look at a couple more break moves. How about if someone plays a French and they play a Rubinstein variation? Where are their break moves? And the answer is, basically, since the white pawn can't go up to d5 very easily, the break moves are to play c5 or maybe to play e5. Or let's say you're playing in a Caro-Can and you get some, Caro-Slav kind of pawn takes, knight takes, and let's say you get a line where the pawn gets to, I'm just making, they get to some lines like this. Queen goes here, threatens, knight takes f7, so you got to guard the e pawn, so knight to b6. This pawn structure is like a Caro-Slav pawn structure, and later on what black's going to do after he castles is he's probably going to break with c5. He needs to break up these white pawns, or else if he sits there with the pawns like they are here, and I've seen many, many students play these openings, and then just sit there forever and not break, and then they wonder, why did I get such a cramped position? Well, if you don't break in these positions, then black's going to have just much less space. White's pieces are going to occupy 4 to 5 ranks worth of play, and black's pieces are back here occupying only 3 ranks. So he's going to be like super cramped if you don't play your break moves. So here, as I said, the break moves are c5 and e5, and that's what you're going to play whenever you get into these kind of pawn structures. And we could set up every pawn structure possible from every opening. You know, King's Gambit. Where's the break move? f4. That's what he plays. Roy Lopez. Where's White's break move? He's going to try to get in d4, but unlike the Scotch, where he plays d4 right away and lets black take, and he has to take back with a piece, later on in the Roy Lopez, you know, we've already looked at the closed Roy Lopez as one of our earlier videos. Then White plays here to prepare his break move, d4. Notice this is the fixed pawn. And black castles, and White plays h3. And now let's say what black plays the Zaitsev variation, bishop b7. Here we go, break move, d4. Is that his only break move? No, he could break with f4. And b4 is sort of a break move. b4 is not a 100% break move because black could play, sorry, a4 is not a 100% break move because black could play b4. But it is close to a break move. Break moves aren't always so black and white. Most of the time they are, but occasionally you get moves where you attack his pawn and he could go past you, but he has to pay somewhat of a price to do that, in which case playing that move is akin to sort of playing a break move. And moves like that are very often called something other than break moves. If you read a book on that kind of thing, they might say, you know, critical pawn pushes or critical pawn somethings with a word other than break if they're doing something where he might be able to go past them. So there's kind of a nuance there. All right, so today we've defined break moves. We've shown many examples of break moves. We've talked about how important they are in the opening, the middle game, and the end game. Break moves, it's just something that you have to know, and in each position you have to know, where are my break moves, which one do I want to play for, which pieces do I need to get out first, and if I play that break move, who's going to help more? If you play a break move and it's not called for in your position, very often your break move could help your opponent more than it helps you, in which case, yes, that was your break move, but it was a break move you should not have played. So you have to be careful, and that's why you play over lots of annotated master games to see when they do it, where they do it, how they do it. Okay, this is Dan Heisman. Hope you enjoyed our video. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.